SBU is the Spina Bifida Association's new viral education program. Our goal is to bring the world's best care providers and resources directly into your home. SBU is the only free webinar series dedicated solely to the educational, employment, social, self-advocacy, and health needs of people with spina bifida. We hope that you will enjoy this presentation. Interventions for attention and executive dysfunctions, and that you take the time to complete the evaluation at the close of this presentation.
Okay, so I am very fortunate that all of the background has been well set up for you for today. So I don't have to go a whole lot into what the deficits or the strengths are, because everyone has already done that for me pretty in a detailed manner as well. So I'm mostly going to focus on what some potential interventions are, and I'm going to focus more specifically on higher-end technology rather than low-tech technology. I really don't need to go over this slide. We've heard this in detail over and over again. I am going to focus primarily on attention, orientation, and regulation, though, for this particular talk, because there's only so much time. So, as we heard, attentional problems in children and also adults, we haven't talked so much about adults so far, are pretty prevalent. And we see that these attentional problems affect at least a quarter of the population. And what has been reinforced throughout our talks this morning is that it's not all aspects of executive function that we see deficit in. There's many areas that we see strengths. It's not so much that they can't sustain attention. In fact, give somebody a task, and they will do it and do it and do it and do it until you tell them to stop. And sometimes that can cause problems, and I have put together some case scenarios that are going to exemplify that in my talk. The other thing is that what often happens is that these executive function problems they go unrecognized, and what they are seen as is someone being lazy. And that's a huge problem, and how someone is labeled or not pushed to achieve in areas that they could be very successful in if they had the right supports. So for cognitive rehabilitation strategies in general, we have two ways that we can kind of tackle this. Basically, we can try to remediate. We can try to actually improve the person's skills. And we talked about kind of how people could practice over and over again, and then we'll actually see that their skills will change over time, that they will become better at it. Rehearsal and repetition are key to that. The other thing that we can do is we can attempt to compensate for these deficits. And in many instances, that is the faster fix. Not that you have to stop trying to remediate, but in the meantime, how are you going to make that person functional? So compensation is often a good strategy as well. As I mentioned, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about the low-tech strategies for cognitive deficits. We all use them every day. Who doesn't carry around some type of planner? Most of us are using higher tech technology now, too, in order to help us navigate and keep track of our busy lives and schedules. But it's not to say that the low-tech strategies are to be discounted, but sometimes can be supplemented by some of these other areas. So assistive technology, it's an area of interest for me. I've been working on this for the last several years, so it's close to my heart now. But basically, it's any item, piece of equipment, or product, whether it's acquired off the shelf, so it could be for the general public that it's being used, or it could be something that's actually been modified and customized for a person with a disability. The main point about assistive technology, though, is that for the most part, it's not concerned with actually remediating the disability, but instead helping them come up with functional results, and that may instead be a compensatory strategy. I've included this model in here because I think it's important that we think about all of these aspects, and I actually am adding two aspects to what they call the HAT model by Cook and Hussey. The human component obviously is very important. You have to consider the person as an individual before you choose what type of assistive technology you're going to utilize. And we all bring strengths, and we all have areas that we need some assistance. The activity is also important. Sometimes it's the activity that can be modified. We talked about the fact, is it really important that a child handwrites this paper? Could they type it instead? Now the activity has changed. The person hasn't changed. The technology that's being used has changed, but the activity has also changed. Assistive, how is it actually helping the person? What component is the technology doing? What portion does the person still need to be engaged in? And then obviously the technology or the device itself. Again, I want to stress, though, that technology just doesn't mean this elaborate device. Technology could be sticky pads, quite literally. The other aspect, as I mentioned, that isn't actually included in the HAT model, but I like to add to it, is policy and funding, because that does make a difference into what we can actually accomplish with individuals in many instances. So if we add a P to that, and we're going to change this into the FATE model instead of the HAT model. Policy with many individuals and a lot of the assistive technology that I'm going to go over today, it's still not to the point where they're willing to pay for things like an iPhone or maybe a Motorola Zoom. You know, that's not something that the insurance company is yet willing to buy for an individual, but I think that we're going to see changes in that. And then finally, the other thing that you really need to consider is the environment. So how socially acceptable is it to be using this device in this environment? Is it going to make them stand out among their coworkers? Is it going to be cumbersome to be used in the environment? If they're doing an activity that maybe could involve moisture, maybe this isn't where we want to have this device. You know, so that really is an important component as well as the demands of the environment. How distracting is the environment, and so on. So, what I like to refer to as handheld electronic cognitive orthoses. This has really changed a lot in recent years. Okay, so at one point in time, these were things that people used. And this Scion organizer, it cost thousands of dollars. Comes with a system. This is not that long ago, believe it or not. These were devices that were created for persons with cognitive disabilities. Primarily, a lot of the research that we see around using these types of devices we see with the TBI population. That's where most of the literature is focused. Some of the deficits are similar, so we can make some links with it. There have not been a lot of good research, actually any research studies that are out there of using these types of devices with the spina bifida population to date. Hopefully, I would like to add to that, and there will be some. But the point of this is that these devices from way back when were created specifically for persons with disabilities. And as a result, the technology did not move forward very quickly. But what they did do is they allowed for people to be able to take them with them wherever they were at. Now they weren't stuck behind a computer. They weren't stuck at home. They were able to go out into the community and take their technology with them to be functional in the environment of their choice. The other thing that has happened in recent years is that people in general are more tech savvy. So the kids that grew up using computers in their classrooms every day are now adults. So this is not something that's entirely foreign to them. Everybody and their brother is carrying around a smartphone, right? How many people in the audience use one themselves? Okay, so pretty close to at least 90%, I'd say. And we actually surveyed our adult population at the UPMC clinic, and 85% of them, and this is several years ago, were cell phone users. And now they're switching over to smartphones. So, you know, a lot of the conversation, well, if somebody has a cognitive deficit that's severe enough for them to need this, how are they going to be able to figure out how to use this complicated device? Well, they're quite intuitive, actually, and for the most part, individuals are able to navigate these systems. The other component of it that it comes up a great deal is the fine motor component. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, as well as the visual perceptual things that could affect using a touch screen and so on. So we moved away from these devices that were specifically made for persons with disabilities, and we're now looking at a whole plethora of handheld wireless devices that are created for the general public. As a result of being created for the general public, two things are happening. One, they're getting a lot less expensive, because the more you make of something, the less expensively you can produce it. The other thing that's happening, because the general population is using these devices for the same types of things, is that the software and the development is moving 10 times, well, I should say probably 1,000 times faster than what it was before. So we don't see 10 years go by before we see new systems available. We see things happening literally overnight and changing, which makes it pretty exciting. So I'm going to go into a few devices. I'm not going to cover every single device. I am not advocating for one versus the other. I will tell you that in our research we are using Android devices simply because it's open source technology and you don't require permission from Big Brother, the App Store, to let you publish things and get things out there. But really that's the only reason why. There's, like I said, one's not better than the other, and I'm not advocating for one versus the other. I will say, though, that the App Store at this point in time has more apps than any other, rather than BlackBerry or the Android platform, but it's been out a little bit longer, and they're starting to catch up. Last check that I saw was that there were over 350,000 apps available on the App Store. Doesn't mean they're all good or useful apps, though, I will tell you that. In fact, the handout that I gave to you, that front side with the chart that says, hey, there's an app for that, that probably took me the longest period of time to create because I sorted through a lot of really crappy apps. Let's just put it that way. Apps that didn't function entirely appropriately or maybe weren't the best designed for someone with spina bifida. So the ones that I've selected on that sheet give kind of a general idea of some of the apps that are available. There certainly are many, many more that are appropriate for persons with spina bifida. But those are some that I know that I've tested and I've used that work. So I have obviously not tested them all out. Some of the things that are available on the iPod Touch, though. So the iPod Touch is actually probably the least expensive option that you have to go for in order to be able to use apps. So the iPod Touch doesn't require that you have a cellular phone contract, which was what actually makes most of these devices the most expensive. It's the contract that you enter into. So that's what makes it difficult for sometimes families to afford these things. And because you can get it with Wi-Fi so that when you go to a hotspot, that's when you download your app. And you don't need to have constant connection. So you get the app, and really it's a one-time investment of maybe $200 or so. The other thing is that if this is for a younger person, the parent is not quite so concerned that they're maybe accessing as much stuff as what they could with free reign of the internet. So the parental controls can be installed on there, but also they could also regulate when they actually have access to the internet if they know when they're going to hotspots. And a lot of schools don't necessarily have Wi-Fi that a kid can tap into at any point in time. So, and then I have listed there just a few things that are actually available on all iPod Touch devices without actually downloading anything. So the voiceover, the zoom to be able to magnify it, having white on the black background for visual perceptual to make it easier to read, and also the audio that you can change if you want to. Smartphones are actually my favorite device because they are very small and portable, and they serve so many purposes. And the fact that they do serve so many purposes, I think, make them intrinsically valuable to people, that they want to carry them with them. If there's one thing that you'll go back home and get if you've left it at home in the morning, what is it? It's your phone. I'm not going anywhere without that phone. I feel naked if I don't have it. I need it. I need it with me all the time. Where is it? You know, and that's key because it's your connection to your social community. It's connection to the people you love and care about. It's connection to perhaps your doctor. It's connection to everything in your world. And the more that we're using these devices for additional purposes, they have much more meaning than just being these queuing devices. A lot of the earlier studies that looked at PDAs, which basically had all the same functions of a smartphone without the phone component or the internet, it didn't work. People left the PDA at home. Then when they needed it out in the community, they didn't have it because they weren't that motivated. Didn't have value beyond just completing those specific tasks and things that they needed to do at work. So they weren't as likely to have it with them on their person all the time. The fact that people do carry their smartphones with them everywhere all the time allows for them to be able to utilize them in every single environment. And I have listed there just a few of the great functions that are there and that actually allow these apps to function, for instance, a GPS incorporated into smartphones that we don't have in other devices. The final device that I chose to show you or to talk about is the newest to come out. It's the tablet, and the tablet has become very popular among children with disabilities, particularly the autism population. They've really taken this and run with it for social stories and things like that. And some of those same apps are actually very useful, too, for persons with spina bifida. And I have highlighted one or two of them on the handout that I've given you. But a lot of them aren't, so having text-to-speech is not useful for spina bifida. However, the opposite way around, like drag and dictation and taking voice to text, that is helpful because it takes away the need to type. And that's actually available on Android, BlackBerry, and on the tablets. Not all of the apps run the same on tablets as what they do on the smartphone devices too, which is important to know. Some of them will crash if you try to use them on a tablet. So when you're recommending that, make sure that you research which it actually operates on correctly. But the great thing about the tablet is it's bigger. So if you are having problems with using that tiny little screen, that now you have this much larger surface that they can manipulate. The other thing that's nice is that because it does give a larger visual display, it makes it more engaging that way too for individuals. And so there's an app for pretty much everything. I wish there were an app to make it a little bit warmer in here today, to be honest with you. But the apps that we see out there, most of them are not designed for persons with disabilities. Most of them are not designed to perform healthcare tasks that work in combination with anyone else. And our later talk, the last talk today, is actually going to talk about apps that we've created specifically for persons with spina bifida that allow them to interact with their clinician. But what most apps do is they choose a specific task that someone wants to accomplish, and they design basically a software program just around that. And some of you may have seen on Dateline or whatever, there are kids that are out there designing apps. They're not that hard to create. You can download the software for free or buy it from Apple for a small fee. And you can create an app yourself. So that's allowing clinicians to be able to create apps for the first time. You don't have to have a doctoral degree in health information management in order to make an app. You can be a layperson and be able to accomplish this. But apps that actually use the interface is what we're looking at doing, which does take a lot more work, and also keeping in mind that all this information that's being collected and shared back and forth is health information, and therefore we have to follow HIPAA guidelines. So that changes things a little bit too. So I mentioned that rather than just talking about all these apps, what I did is I put together a few little scenarios and how they could be used. And this one is based on a true life story of a young man that I helped this past year. Obviously names and such have been changed. But I'll read it out loud to you. So Jeremy is a 12-year-old who entered middle school last year and has spina bifida myelomeningocele. And the earlier talk couldn't have led into this any better. So his grades began to decline drastically after a fairly successful career of mostly A's and B's in elementary school. An IEP meeting was held and accommodations were made. So they had an IEP meeting. He already has an IEP in place, but he's changed. Obviously, he's had this huge transition in his life, going from elementary school to middle school. And we talked a little bit earlier about how the academic performance and what a child needs to accomplish as far as problem solving and being able to put together concepts and things like that, how that changes, and why the executive function deficits that we see may have been sort of hidden before and why they come out now. But the other really big thing that happens when you move from elementary school to middle school is the environment changes. The environment changes, and now you have to change class, and you have maybe 6 different teachers instead of 1 or 2 teachers that you see. The way that you organize your materials is different, because now you're keeping all your stuff in a locker, and you have to take it with you to class, and you have to put it back, and you don't have a desk necessarily that this is where all my stuff is for every class, and this is where I'm going to keep it. So the environment has really changed, and those kinds of demands really impact a student, and not just students with spina bifida, but lots of kids begin to struggle at this point in time. So they had an IEP meeting, and they made some accommodations, and these are typical accommodations that occur. So his teacher and his parents, they start using the communication book because he's not doing his homework, basically, and he's not turning it in, too. That's the other thing. So even when he does his homework, and it's all done, and his parents see it, he gets to school, and then he doesn't give it to the teacher, and so he gets a 0. True story. How frustrating is that? And the parents are frustrated because they know they spent 3 hours trying to get him to do this. No, it's done. Then they look, and a lot of schools now have online where the teachers are posting grades every day, and parents can really keep up and have great communication, but they can't be there and make them turn it in right there at that very moment. So the other things that they do is he doesn't remember to bring stuff home, so this is really typical too. So they send home a second set of books, but he doesn't remember to bring home maybe worksheets or whatever it might be that need to go along with the books, so it's still frustrating. His parents, they try to punish him, but punishment doesn't work because he's trying. He's working his butt off. He doesn't understand why things are so different right now. And really the only thing that's happened from the punishment is that now he's more frustrated and he's socially isolated because he's not been allowed to go out and do things with his friends because he's struggling in school. So it's not really having a positive effect. So, enters the iPod Touch. And I guess one thing that I have to point out is that kids love these devices too. So you're not giving them something that makes them look weird. What is this that you have? Everybody and their brother wants one of these devices. It might be that all his friends aren't allowed to use them in the classroom. That was an issue with this particular student, that he had to have permission in order to get it out in class, because these devices can also be used to cheat and to do a number of other things or be off task, because they have a lot of other cool stuff that you can use on them. So there were really specific guidelines that we had to put together. He actually signed a contract. These are my rules for using my iPod Touch at school. And I know that this is what I have to do, and I'm going to sign this contract, and if I don't use it appropriately, I won't be permitted to use this device at school. So his parents had seen some improvements. We actually trialed it at home first to have him keep on top of chores, and wanted to see if it would work before we tried to introduce this to the school team, because this was new and nobody else was allowed to have an iPod Touch at school. And success, And why do you think that using a device like this, based on what we learned this morning, is going to be better than having your typical planner where you write down your homework assignments? What's the big difference? Anybody? Motivation it's cool, yes, that's true, but it's more than just that. It actually has to do with executive functions. The reminders. So how do you remember to look at something that you can't remember to do in the first place? That planner isn't going to jump out at you and say, hey, time to check me out. But the iPod Touch is. It's going to go off with an alarm. It's going to cue them to use it. That's the important part. So that initiation that's missing, it actually provides the cue for the missing initiation. And, of course, it's cool. We used an extra strategy in it, too, that if he used it appropriately every week, that he was actually recording his homework assignments and following through and turning stuff in, that he got to download another app each week. So the iPod Touch became more and more valuable as it had cool things on it that he could do for fun, too. But if he didn't do well and he didn't use it the right way, no app that week. So that was another successful way to utilize that, without any more expense to the parents, because most of these apps are free. So this was the particular app, and it's on your list too. It's, I think, the very first one. Excellent one to help kids organize their homework. And I've just included some screenshots here. When we do our apps later this afternoon, I'm actually going to demo them. But I'm using the Android, and this is an iPhone app, so I can't do that for you right now. But basically, it allows them to separate all their subjects. It allows them to use a calendar function. It can remind them a couple days in advance, particularly for those bigger projects that need chunking done to them. So like a report, not the night before. I have a 20-page report that's due. So chunking it allows them to really be able to strategize that way. That's the other thing that changes as they get older. Here's another one, more around a young adult and basic ADLs. So Ralph is a 19-year-old adult who lives in a transitional living facility, and he needs to do his laundry on a specific day of the week because he's sharing these laundry facilities with other residents, and he needs to have his time structured so that he can engage in other activities. On his laundry day, Ralph hangs out with his buddies, he chats on the internet, time just slips on by. He's sustained. in his activity. We mentioned that shifting. And he was sustained in that activity for hours and hours and hours. And he didn't get done what he needed to get done. So at bedtime, he realizes, I have no clean clothes. I have nothing to wear tomorrow. And he's angry. Why didn't somebody tell me? Well, you had time, and this is a typical scenario. As Tim mentioned, I work for the Spina Bifida Association of Western PA for a number of years, and we have a transitional living program there called the Gatehouse. And this was the first opportunity for many of these young adults to learn how to be responsible for their own self-care and daily household management tasks. And over again, we saw this kind of thing happen. So this particular app allows you to set a time and actually provides a visual display of how much time you have left. So sometimes the idea that I have 20 minutes left doesn't really mean a whole lot. But if I can look at it visually and see I have this much time left until it's time to move on to my next task or activity, then somebody can plan more appropriately. So setting an app like this to follow through, and again, it's something they're carrying with them, especially if it's on their iPhone, they can be on task throughout their day. So I also wanted to move on to a little bit of wayfinding. That's the final example that I'm giving in this portion. And we know that, as the earlier presenters mentioned, that visual spatial orientation is sometimes an issue, and actually where you are in relationship to another building or even getting around a facility like this. For me, it's also difficult. Can be a problem, but can also impact, in the example that I've given, this person's workplace. So Joan, who also has spina bifida, has begun her first paid job at a local college campus at age 23. She's been provided with a few workplace modifications, such as frequent breaks to take care of personal needs, and is also receiving some on-site job coaching services. Her administrative position, it requires her to go to several buildings throughout the campus. She's having a lot of trouble because it's taking her way longer to get from building to building than it should. She's getting lost in between, basically. So the good news is that all the buildings are accessible, so when she gets to them, she can get in. That's not an issue. But her job coach has been helping her find landmarks, and that was mentioned as a way that can actually be very effective. I think there was that study where they were going through the maze and there was the dog, and that's been seen as a successful way. But in this particular instance, she's still having a lot of lag in the amount of time that it should take her to get from building A to building B. She does have an iPhone, though. So her job coach has an idea about how he might be able to help her when he can't actually physically be there with her on campus. Because a job coach often does not go with the person during all of their working hours, maybe only a portion of them to check in. So this particular app was actually developed by AbleLink Technologies, and they're doing a lot of great work. They, at one point in time, developed these specific devices for people with disabilities too, but they're on board now with the idea that we can use these commercially available devices and just create the apps to load on them. So this Community Sidekick app would be so useful not just for the scenario that I just gave in the workplace, but for community integration, basically. So taking the bus for the first time, getting out into the community without one's parents, and really the parents having an option now that they can check in as the person and actually using the GPS to know where they are too in case they have problems. So the way this works, the person it's automated unless you intervene, and then it doesn't need to be automated. So every 5, 10, whatever minute interval that you set it at, it sends an automatic email to the individual to tell the location, and will also prompt the person to say, I'm okay, or I need help, So that way there's peace of mind knowing that this person's moving throughout the community without a whole lot of issue. And you see too that it's not a whole lot of information that they have to put in, it's just one or the other, I'm okay, or please call me right away, It's not like you have to type in, I'm having all these issues, I can't find out where I am. And then it's also linked into the maps, so that those directions can be read aloud to the individual to help them get out of whatever situation they might be stuck in. I'm a big fan of that app. Other useful apps that I've listed, again, I've just done some screenshots just to give you an idea of what's out there, because we're going to move more towards the self-care component for our later talk. Grocery IQ, great app, again, to help somebody organize themselves so as they're moving throughout the grocery store, not just to organize themselves, but also to budget so they have enough money when they get to the cash register to pay for it. One that's maybe a little bit more geared towards younger children, but often we see as part of problem-solving issues, that we know it's cold outside, but why are you wearing that tank top? So this actually uses the information from what's available through the Weather Channel or whatever other link that it might be connecting into to tell you what temperature it is outside, but then actually taking that information and looking in a virtual closet to come up with what's a good outfit to wear today before they ever leave the house. My med schedule, I'm going to go into that one a little bit more because I mentioned that we are actually creating some apps specifically for persons with spina bifida, but this is a commercially available one, a really great one actually. It's a little bit more complicated than I'd like to see. It seems like it has maybe a little bit more than what's necessary in some instances, but again, very nice for what's commercially available right now, and I haven't found any errors in it in trying it out myself. And also a huge fan of Spark People because it has that online resource that goes along with it. If anybody's ever tried Spark People, again, not created for persons with disabilities, but allows for chatting with a group of other individuals, so it has like a social networking component to it, so that actually helps people follow through with their goals that they have set for themselves. So, as I mentioned earlier in my talk, the smartphones are actually getting smarter because the providers and manufacturers, Verizon in particular, is becoming aware that there's this huge potential for their devices that they created for the general public to now be not just cell phones to talk and chat and socialize, but actually to use for medical intervention and to support persons with disability in the community. So they're on board with that, and so they're moving forward with it. As I mentioned too, apps can be tailored and customized. Because they are just a software program that sits on this other platform, you can very easily modify to have, for instance, a list of meds rather than having all the meds in the world in there, the most common meds that are relevant for persons with spina bifida, so they're not having to search through a really lengthy amount of information. So it's not the end of what I'm going to present, so we're going to break and we're going to talk about self-management in between, but then I'm going to kind of pick up from here. So I'm not going to have any summary or conclusions to my slide because I'm not done yet.
Thank you for attending this session. Because meeting your needs is important to us, we need your feedback on the presentation. Please take a few moments to complete our evaluation, which can be located by clicking on the presenter's name located to your left on the screen. It will only take a few clicks of your mouse to provide us information to make the SBU experience better for you and others. If you have any questions relating to SBU, please contact us at sbu@sbaa.org.